I want to start with, first of all, that statistic, 47% of all jobs, according to Oxford, in the next 20 years are going to disappear. Philip, I want to start with you in terms of the macroeconomic picture. What does that mean?
So macroeconomists tend to point to the idea that we don't see wage growth in the US, which is true. And when you don't see wage growth, well, that is not consistent with the idea that everyone's competing for the same talent. If everyone was, we'd see wages go up. There are other arguments that macroeconomists make, such as we also are in an era of very low productivity growth in the United States. That means output per worker isn't really moving. Now, if it's not really moving and we have all this technology around us, how is that consistent? How is it that businesses are not able to leverage technology to transform their business models? And if they're not fully leveraging technology yet, how can that really produce a skills gap? So macroeconomists have some doubts around that. But I think being a macroeconomist in a management consulting firm, we take sort of the aggregate view of the macroeconomy and we start breaking it down by sectors and industries. And that's where the story becomes very interesting. So I think there's a huge amount of variability when you look across maybe some 60, 70 sector splits of the US economy. So when you look back 20, 30 years, manufacturing for sure is a prime example. There are other sectors such as financial services where it doesn't quite hold true yet. So you had output growth in financial services and you had at the same time rising employment. And by the way, even while ATMs were rolled out, you saw sort of an uptick in bank branch employees, right? But we don't know the future. What's going to happen when blockchain hits the back office? What's going to happen when the payment systems are going to be revolutionized by blockchain technology? So I think we got to look at each sector individually. And now let me just finish by taking it to the firm level. That's really where we work with clients. The questions that firms are facing in this field are questions such as, well, given my business model, my geographic footprint, and my segment in my given industry, what are the challenges? Is it really the 400 or 1,000 engineers I'll need in 20 or 25? Or it could be a bigger question, which is about technology and globalization themselves. So think about Airbnb in New York State just last week or 2 weeks ago. Basically, their business model is being limited through regulation. Think about Uber running into regulatory issues around the world. Think about Brexit. So there's a lot of challenge to technology itself. We don't really know how it's going to evolve. It's not a linear process. There could even be a popular backlash against some elements of technology. So what we're really saying is, apart from solving the skill gap issue, companies have to ask themselves, how can we make sure that we understand these dynamics, these processes, that we read them accurately, that we translate them into strategy, that we have the agility, the flexibility, that we have adaptive strategy to actually work against those trends as they unfold.
And on that issue, Chauncey, in terms of how is JP Morgan Chase, an investment institution, reading the transition and the changes and the challenges?
Picking up on a couple of the points Philip was making, I think another dimension of this, or another way of saying what he was saying, is that we often think of the problem we're facing because we use the framing of the skills gap as a supply side problem. That's a problem about training and increasing the types of skills in the workforce. And to be sure, that is a big part of the challenge. But the skills gap framing masks the reality that this is also, in some ways, a bigger demand side problem. How do firms behave when it comes to human capital, investing in human capital, having a clear strategy about the kind of talent they need to be competitive? And quite honestly, it's hard to understate how badly most firms do at that. So much of the challenge we face is that firms are not very good, in the first case, at signaling what it is they're looking for labor and talent. Sometimes that's because they're just not good at communicating. Sometimes it's because they don't actually know what it is they're going to need. They have a hard time telling you what they need right now, and they have an even harder time telling you what they're going to need as skills demands change due to technology and other forces. So JP Morgan Chase, when we were trying to think about our priorities around our sort of larger corporate responsibility, we were really listening to our clients. These are businesses of all shapes and sizes and all sectors. And the thing we heard most acutely was the challenge around finding the right workforce, in particular the right workforce with a set of technical skills. And so we've launched a series of initiatives, one of them called New Skills at Work, which is a 5-year, $250 million initiative that is thinking about how we build the right kind of infrastructure, the right kind of data infrastructure, the right kind of supply side, training infrastructure, and the right kind of demand side, whether it's sector or other kind of firm collaboration that allows us to build strong, aligned, demand-driven workforce systems.
And those technical skills, science, technology, engineering, and math at a very early age. Crystal, you've been very involved in Siemens about trying to make sure that that's accessible across all sorts of different demographics. How's that going, and what kind of support are you seeing?
When we started our program just about a year ago, a little over a year ago, we decided to really focus in very narrowly on this STEM technical workforce for several reasons. Siemens, as well as others within the sectors that we work in, had seen this challenge, had been very focused for years on these kind of hired credential jobs, whether they be engineers or others, and there was a lot of great work really happening there. But what they saw was this really shortage around these workers with the technical skills kind of right there in the middle. Workers who had more than a high school diploma, less than a 4-year degree, but very specific technical skills to either advanced manufacturing, energy work, healthcare work, IT work. And when we looked at this issue more broadly from a philanthropic perspective, we noticed that not only was that a challenge for other employers, but it was a challenge for economic growth in major metropolitan areas. Brookings came out with a study a few years ago, I believe 2014, that really looked at this, what they called the hidden STEM economy, and looked at kind of where the economic demand was in major metropolitan areas, where the opportunities were and where the gaps were, and it fell really within this kind of middle credentialed STEM workforce. And that led us to really look at, okay, so what are the outcomes available to people who pursue these jobs? They're great. These are average salaries that start at $50,000 plus. These are jobs that have endless ladder potential within their industries, as well as within the educational pathway for the young person or for whoever the worker. Really, this is just a starting point for them when they're in a technical workforce. They can continue to advance, particularly within STEM. And so for us, that was the kind of place where social need, both on the demand side and the supply side, as well as kind of what assets we could bring from the perspectives of Siemens, really kind of met in a perfect match. And so we started to really target how could we rebrand and in a positive way these career opportunities. We target young people. We look at ages 16 to 29, mainly because of some of the data that came out from OECD several years ago showing that we were really struggling compared to our international peers, particularly in numeracy with that group. And so that's a key skill set for the STEM workforce. But we knew that we really needed to make these attractive opportunities for young people. Too often, and Chauncey could probably speak to this as well from some of his work, these careers are seen as kind of second choice or vocational simply because they don't require a bachelor's degree. And we, as a country, we put a lot of emphasis on that, as we should. It is a valued pathway, but we should also then take a step back and look at the other opportunities available along that pathway. And then we also really focus on accelerating training models that work. And so far, within a year of work, we've seen some really great outcomes. So we've seen states committed to advancing models around work-based learning, whether that be apprenticeships or internships, things that really connect a young person who's had a lack of advantage or opportunity to the classroom and to the workplace. And we've seen that excel.
I do want to get to Chauncey in just a second about the perceptions of not going to a 4-year college and instead doing an apprenticeship. But Martin, you've worked at the President Obama's Jobs Council. And yet, would you agree with the theory that the solution for all of this really isn't at the federal level, it's more at state, local, regional economies and collaboration?
David, yes, I would agree that it is at the state and local level. Practice actually occurs at that level, and it is that practice that can help inform the policy at the national level. What we have seen work really well from our experience are these regional coalitions where you have literally collaboratives that have been put in place, partnerships. They come by all different types of titles and names that are composed of, historically, workforce investment boards, community colleges, other thought leaders, could be local NGOs like Goodwill that are participating, And they start to create a movement towards a skill building initiative or a talent pipeline. But I think what has happened recently, and what we're starting to see a trend, and it comes back to some of the points that were made by my colleagues, is we're now seeing deep employer engagement. There is a business imperative now. Yeah, they're starting to recognize that, whoa, I'm going to have some difficulty in my business in all sorts of dimensions, and if I'm not engaged in this talent development process, then I'm actually being negligent in some way to my own community. So it is local, but the coalition building now is now inclusive of the employer voice, which I think is absolutely critical.
And yet, despite this sort of deep employer engagement, so much of this is driven by economic anxieties, a transformation that is happening so quickly, and a feeling amongst these voters that our institutions are not there to help them or to understand.
I started on this journey 3 years ago. I thought I had to look out, 5 to 10 years. But what we've watched over the last year in these presidential campaigns, it's here today. These are, when you turn on the, CNN or whatever you'll turn on today, and you'll see, 25,000 people showing up at a Trump rally, and if Bernie had a rally, you'd see 25,000. Those are people who are in pain. And the pain is largely job and economic related. And I think it went very much unrecognized. Now, it's interesting, putting aside the recent presidential debates, but even if you look back over the last, this whole campaign, 20 different candidates, very, very little discussion about jobs and most particularly solutions. And in defense of all the candidates, going back to what was being discussed a moment ago, the solutions aren't at the federal level. It's not to say that federal tax policy and budget policy can't have influences, but the solutions are created at the local level. Corporations, not-for-profits, academic institutions, and local government. And that is a key theme, and the stories that we will be telling at Working Nation on a continuing basis will really be focused on that.
And some of the American brands, or some of the brands as related to this conference, American ingenuity, the land of opportunity. Philip, if the United States is not able to come up with a competitive solution vis-a-vis other countries, what does that do overall to the U.S. brand and relatedly to the American economy?
There's one piece of information that is important, which is both these forces, globalization and technology, they're quite universal. I mean, other nations are struggling with that, not just as much. There's a timeline. And so some countries will experience this later. But just think about globalization first. What is globalization in the context we speak about? It's the spatial fragmentation of firms, value chains, and supply chains in ever more countries, squeezing out wage differentials that you basically capture. Now, that same process, that affects all countries. So we think about jobs being shipped to China where they presumably pile up. But in reality, Samsung, for example, they took their flat panel production out of China and moved it to Vietnam. Why? Because Vietnamese wages are where Chinese wages were 15 years ago. So I think that the principle is pretty much universal, and others will get there, and some advanced economies in Europe, they're already there. So, everyone's a little bit in the same boat. When it comes to technology, it's even more dramatic because technology is instantaneous, right? So you don't have to sort of wait 5 years until the impact is visible or felt. It will be right there, right now. And China, too, I mean, they're aspiring to be an economy. They're modeling themselves a little bit after Germany. So they want to be high-tech, knowledge-based, skills-based. That's going to be interesting when they try to close that skills gap that they undoubtedly also have. So, I think it's a very big challenge, but I think the U.S. is not in the worst position to address it.
Is it, though, in one of the better positions to address it, or where would you put the United States in terms of?
I'll defer to colleagues. I just think when you look at some European countries, particularly Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Holland. I mean, it's not just the very large corporations like Siemens who have a long track record on investing in vocational training, building their own pipeline of employees. It's even smaller countries, the so-called German Mittelstand. There's a long history of that. So I think in terms of that learning curve, some of these countries have a little advantage there. But there's no reason why we can't learn from that and why we maybe even do it better. So I think that would be my take on it.
Crystal, you had identified earlier one of the key challenges in terms of our youth, and that is there's a perception that if you're not going to a four-year college or if you're going to become an automotive mechanic, that's a very sort of different than becoming an automotive technician. And Chauncey, to you, because Crystal teed this up for you, how significant is the labeling, the perceptions among youth in terms of solving part of this?
So, I think a big part of this, and you use the word investment, so the reality is that the branding, it seems to me you want, is to be known for investing, right? The labor market is not going to produce the kind of skills without investment from all sorts of, from the private sector and from government. And where we have gotten ourselves, so to the point about globalization, that's the problem that everyone faces, right? This is how you get your human capital system to be agile enough to connect to your economy is an enduring tension. In the U.S., I think we did take a misstep. We sort of went on a track where when we thought of education, we thought of it as kind of college or bust, right? We sort of have moved to a model where the message is get a 4-year degree. And there's lots of reasons for that, lots of good reasons why we pursued that. But the reality is that that's not where we want to be. We want to be sending the signal to students who are interested, who have the skills to make the most of college to do that. But we want to give other students who are not interested or who have other kinds of skill sets, we want to invest in them as well. And that's where we've gone off track. We are not providing both the information about opportunities and then the training in the whole set of technical skills that are so much a part of our economy. I can't remember if Crystal said this, but close to half the jobs in our economy do not require a BA. That doesn't mean you might not get a BA over time, but it does mean that having a kind of go to college, spend 4 years, take a lot of risk is not really a model that's going to work for lots of young people. And that's sort of where we are today. We've got most kids want to go to college. Most kids start some kind of post-secondary, but huge numbers, and especially low-income kids, don't make it very far. They end up exiting post-secondary without skills, without a job, without credentials, and oftentimes in lots of debt. And that's a huge loss to our economy, and we don't have those kids trained up and ready to go.
And yet, Crystal, you can just as easily, as one of the other panelists mentioned, you can do a 6-month apprenticeship, a 2-year program, and come out with an upper middle class job, whereas if you go to a 4-year undergraduate, even an Ivy League institution in liberal arts, there's no guarantee.
That's right. And I think, a lot of that issue it's an awareness issue along with some perception issues. What we have found, particularly with this most recent generation of young people who actually went through the recession, they're very open to the idea of alternative career and educational pathways. They simply don't know about them. There really isn't a lot of information out there about how do you become a process technologist or a respiratory therapist, per se. Not as much as there is about how do you become an engineer or a doctor, particularly if you're checking in with the traditional influencers on that, whether it be your career counselor at your high school or maybe even your parents, right? There's just not a lot of dialogue about those opportunities. And so, what it takes in addition to building the infrastructure, which we have a lot of opportunity to do right now in the U.S. around these technical training programs, whether it's an apprenticeship program or whether it's a 2-year degree within a STEM program at a community college, it really takes also this kind of awareness communications campaign about these opportunities exist. They usually will cost you low to no student debt, and when you leave, you will have a valuable and high-paying job that you'll be able to take care of your family and advance from there within these STEM industries that we know will continue to evolve and innovate, but will actually be the industries that will feed a local economy and probably stick around for a while.
I wonder if the panelists could think about 3 jobs of the future that they would recommend to students at these institutions.
Rather than say the 3 jobs, I want to open by saying this. I think the skill that people need to learn is reinvention of new skills. If you think about great companies, I was listening to Dr. Reepstein this morning and talking about brands. Think about companies that have lasted for a long time. They're constantly reinventing themselves. Now, of course, they have multiple resources, capital, what have you, to do that. I worked for a great company at one time that would have been on that top list. It was called Maytag. And it was one of the victims, like Carrier Corporation or what Art and his organization have been able to highlight. They did not reinvent themselves. And people, think about the media and the entertainment in the world where you've come from, people have reinvented themselves all the time. You see that resurrection. Now, I don't know if that's possible because humans sometimes get hardwired in who they are from a behavioral perspective. So I think it's really important that the skill that we are teaching is how to constantly reinvent, which means you have to have access. Future jobs in the medical industry, in the medical field, the healthcare, specifically to your question, Tom, in the healthcare industry, it's still going to have a human touch. There's going to be automation, there's no question. But there are jobs that are not necessarily health related, information technology, engineering, logistics, transportation, home health care outside of the traditional patient environment. Booming industry will be for some time, in my opinion.
So let me just piggyback on that for a second, if I could, which is, I saw some statistic, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it is amazing if you look at our alum, what percent of them work for companies today that didn't exist 10 years ago? And it's an amazingly large percent. I would quote a number, but let me just say it is an amazingly large percent. And I totally agree that what we need to be training is skills about how to reinvent yourself, because the world and the market that's existing is changing. And if I look at the video that Art had put together, things are changing of what it is we need to be capable of doing, because so much of the old things are being replaced with a whole new set of skills that are going to be necessary. So I totally buy into that entirely. So.
Let me add two things to Tom's question. First of all, as the founding funder of the Wharton Customer Analytics Initiative here at the school, which we began in, I guess, July of '08, I believe, I'm meeting with Dean Garrett a little bit later this morning, but I believe we will be launching a concentration here in the whole area of data and analytics. And so to your question of where there will not be any aspect of business, in my judgment, business, government, or not-for-profits that won't be driven by data and analytics. So for those students here who still haven't picked a concentration, I recommend it highly. I'm going to give you another direction that's very atypical for an audience like this. One of the most significant industries that will grow in terms of jobs is the whole not-for-profit world. We are talking about the not-for-profit world today, when broadly defined, is something like 7-8% of the GDP of the United States. And because of demographics and because of issues that we're talking about here, there is going to be a massive increase in the number of jobs. Now, not-for-profits are more often than not run by incredible do-gooders, but not too many people who are educated at Wharton or trained at GE. And I am a very big proponent of people, even at Wharton. I have a daughter who is working in the not-for-profit world. She plans on applying to Wharton to get an MBA, but with the desire to stay within the not-for-profit world. So I just recommend it. Millions of jobs are going to be created in the not-for-profit world.
And it is worth pointing out that AmeriCorps is also a partner with WorkingNation, and one of the things that AmeriCorps has proven is that they have a higher job placement. Once you've been in AmeriCorps, you have a higher job placement than a lot of other institutions, a lot of other organizations. Chauncey, though, you're very involved in this initiative to try to make sure that these skills and this retraining is accessible. Why don't you take Tom's question as well?
Sure. So I would say that I'm guessing most of the students at Penn and Wharton are off to great careers, whatever they choose to do. But I think the thing we see over and over again is that firms are not particularly sophisticated how they think about the kind of talent they're looking for, how they invest in it, how they partner with other firms to make sure you have the right kind of talent supply chains. So a skill I think you're going to need in the future as these forces of globalization and technology take place is a much deeper understanding of the kinds of labor needs firms need, how they shift rapidly given technology, and how you structure a firm in a way to get the right kind of talent, whether that is middle skill jobs or advanced skill jobs or whatever the case may be. I think firms often imagine that the workers they need are just waiting outside that door, ready to go. And I think we are living through an era now where we're going to see it even more and more as labor market tightens, that that's just not the case. And that is it greatly undermines firm competitiveness.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give our panelists a round of applause?